Look, I want to move on to the other, well, it's kind of a developing story over the weekend. The comments Peter Dutton made to the Australian newspaper about the 2030 climate target. He thinks there's no way it's going to be achieved and therefore he's not going to support it. But, you know, does that mean therefore pulling out of the Paris Agreement? I want to show you what the Coalition's Climate Change Energy Minister Angus Taylor had to say a few years back. This is when Labor was still working out in opposition its position on a 2030 target. And Angus Taylor was emphatic that a 2030 target was essential to be in the Paris Agreement.
You can't be in the Paris Agreement without a 2030 target. They are walking away from the Paris Agreement, Mr Speaker. That is their policy position. No 2030 target. That's where you end up.
So, well, now it's the Coalition in opposition. They're saying they don't like the 2030 target. It's a little unclear whether they'd set or try to set a different target. But Paris, the agreement's pretty clear, isn't it, John, that you can't water down the target. You certainly have to have a target, and every 5 years it's meant to increase.
Yeah, so we do require a 2030 target under the agreement, also a 2035 one by I think about next year as well. The line coming out of the Coalition in the last 24 hours is that actually we're just making the point that Labor is not going to reach its own 43% target. I think according to the government's own latest figures, it's going to hit about 42%, but I think there's some doubt about that now because the rollout of the renewables is not going well. One thing I'd ask, though, or sort of throw into the mix is if Donald Trump's elected president of the United States in November, then internationally that could throw a real spanner in the works of the Paris Agreement, and so that could be another sort of thing to throw into the mix.
Yeah,
as well.
it would certainly weaken the Paris Agreement if Trump comes back and withdraws the US, no doubt about that. But as to what the Coalition position is now, Ted O'Brien, the Shadow Minister, well, tried to clarify it yesterday.
Every single target Labor has set has failed. They will fail on the 43% emissions target by 2030. We will not associate ourselves with a Labor lie. We are committed to Paris, the 2050 net zero target.
So that's the only clear commitment there. They're still committed to net zero by 2050, Claire. Before that, 2030, 2035, 2040 is a little less clear.
Yeah, to say the least. I think one thing that's interesting about this is that there are parts of the Coalition party room who would rather there be no net zero by 2050 target at all. So obviously
Maybe the National Party parts of the Coalition?
A few members. But I think it's interesting because I don't necessarily think this announcement is going to fully appease that movement. So it's quite the compromise to make to not necessarily get the entire party room on a unity ticket on this issue. But broader than that, I think there's a problem where this is, you know, it's not all about this, but the Paris Agreement and other, it's about international credibility, it's about message sent to investors, and even if you are still committed to net zero by 2050, if you don't have a credible pathway to get there, then that obviously throws into question the degree of your commitment to net zero. Now, obviously, Labor are not on target at the moment. They like to describe it as being within striking distance. It may sound like 1% is not far off, but in the scheme of emissions, it's quite a lot to cut back on in the next few years. So I think it's going to really come down to this debate about, do we aspire and get close, or do we set a more realistic target and meet it? And that's probably where the conflict is going to come out in this election.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because, Claudia, politically, this might have been aimed at, and as John says, aimed at trying to put some heat on Labor over whether they're going to hit their own 2030 target. But it also puts up in flashing lights, doesn't it? What are the Coalition going to do? I mean, they want to go nuclear and reckon that would, by 2050, get us to net zero. But there's a lot of time in between where it's a little unclear.
Yes, and I think if I were a Teal MP in a formerly Liberal seat this morning, I think I'd be pretty stoked, to be honest, because the main headline out of this, potentially for them, is Peter Dutton, Paris Accord, no more. Really, like Paris Agreement, rather. It strikes me that this isn't really in line with the potential lessons they could have learned from the last election about why those seats are now in the hands of the Teals rather than the Liberals.
Yeah.
And it's going to be interesting, I think, to see the kind of impact this has going into the election.